Blood stained the marble floors of the Chicago Syndicate headquarters, but the Don only looked at the trembling, full-figured Maid in the corner. She leaned in, whispering a single, forgotten Sicilian word into the old man's ear. Across the room, Marco Gallo, the city's most ruthless boss, growled, "She is mine." The crystal chandeliers of the Gallo estate cast harsh, unforgiving light on the elite of Chicago. Outside, the freezing winds coming off Lake Michigan whipped against the bulletproof glass of the Gold Coast mansion. Inside all, it was a den of vipers dressed in tailored Brioni suits and dripping in conflict diamonds. This was the retirement gala of Vincenzo Gallo, the aging patriarch of the Gallo crime syndicate. Hidden in the shadows of this glittering underworld was Chiara Ferraro. She was a maid, invisible by design. In a room full of skeletal socialites and surgically perfected mob wives, Chiara was an anomaly. She possessed a soft, plus-sized figure with lush curves hidden beneath a stiff, ill-fitting black and white uniform. The guests looked right through her, dismissing her as nothing more than part of the decor. But Chiara was far from simple. Beneath her unassuming exterior lay a steely resilience forged by years of surviving the brutal foster system and a sharp intellect honed by a grandfather who had taught her the old ways and the old words of Palermo. She moved quietly through the sprawling library, holding a silver tray of fresh crystal tumblers. The air smelled of aged bourbon, expensive cigars, and danger. Standing by the fireplace was Gavin Marsh, a rising lieutenant in the rival West Side Irish syndicate. Gavin was smooth, dangerous, and known for his unpredictable violence. He was supposed to be here brokering peace, offering a tribute to the retiring Don Vincenzo. Chiara kept her head down, polishing a nearby mahogany side table, but her ears were tuned to the cadence of the room. She watched as Gavin Marsh poured a glass of rare scotch for Vincenzo. But Chiara noticed the sleight of hand, a microscopic flick of Gavin's wrist, a faint dusting of white powder disappearing into the amber liquid. Tension coiled in Chiara's stomach. She knew the rules of the underworld. See nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. To speak was to invite a bullet. But she also knew that if Vincenzo Gallo died tonight, the streets of Chicago would run red with a war that would consume innocent lives, including the people in her own impoverished neighborhood. Vincenzo approached the table, leaning heavily on his silver-headed cane. His sharp, weathered eyes scanned the room before settling on the glass Gavin offered. Chiara did not think. She operated on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. She stepped forward, deliberately stumbling, and crashed her silver tray into the table. The glasses shattered. The poisoned scotch soaked into the priceless Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening. The ambient chatter in the library died instantly. Gavin Marsh turned slowly, his eyes flashing with a murderous rage. "Clumsy, stupid girl!" Gavin snarled, his hand inching toward the inside of his tailored jacket. Before Gavin could draw his weapon, the heavy oak doors of the library slammed open. Marco Gallo had arrived. Marco was a towering force of nature, a billionaire kingpin who had taken the reins of the syndicate from his father with a bloody, ruthless efficiency. He was all sharp edges and coiled violence, radiating a dark, suffocating power. Every man in the room instinctively took a step back. Marco's dark eyes swept the scene, registering the broken glass, Gavin's tense posture, and the trembling Maid on the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" Marco's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Vincenzo looked down at Chiara. The old Don was not a fool. He had seen the desperation in her eyes before she dropped the tray. Chiara slowly pushed herself to her knees. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of Marco's gaze on her, burning through her uniform, seeing past her fuller figure to the defiant core of her soul. She looked up, bypassing Marco, and locked eyes directly with the old Don Vincenzo. She leaned in close, her soft curves brushing against the heavy fabric of Vincenzo's trousers, and whispered a single word in a dialect so old, so pure, that it belonged to the blood-soaked hills of Sicily from a century ago. Veleno. Poison. Vincenzo's body stiffened. His eyes widened slightly, not just at the warning, but at the fact that a random Chicago maid spoke the secret language of the Cosa Nostra. The old Don raised his hand, pointing a single, trembling finger at Gavin Marsh. "Take him," Vincenzo commanded. The room erupted into chaos. Marco's enforcers lunged. Gavin, realizing his plot was exposed, drew his weapon and fired blindly, shattering a window before diving out into the freezing night, escaping into the sprawling grounds of the estate. When the gunfire ceased, Marco crossed the room. His heavy combat boots crunched over the broken glass. He stopped inches from Chiara, looming over her. His hands, stained with the blood of countless enemies, reached down. But instead of grabbing her roughly, his large fingers wrapped gently around her upper arms, pulling her up. Chiara expected to be interrogated, perhaps even killed for knowing too much. Instead, Marco pulled her flush against his solid, muscular chest. He looked at his father, his eyes dark with an obsessive, possessive fire that had never burned there before. "She saved your life," Marco said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper meant only for the three of them. "But she belongs to me now. She is mine." The penthouse at the top of the Gallo Tower was a sprawling, modern fortress in the sky, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. For 3 days, Chiara Ferraro had been trapped inside it. She was no longer wearing the humiliating black-and-white maid's uniform. Marco had ordered her a wardrobe that rivaled European royalty, silks, cashmeres, and custom-tailored dresses that hugged her generous curves perfectly. For a woman who had spent her life feeling too big, too soft, and entirely unworthy of luxury, the attention was both intoxicating and terrifying. Marco treated her with a terrifying reverence. To the rest of the world, he was the devil of Chicago. He ruled the underworld with an iron fist, dissolving his enemies in acid and orchestrating million-dollar racketeering schemes before his morning espresso. But around Chiara, the beast was leashed. He watched her constantly, his gaze heavy and consuming, tracking her every movement across the vast living room. "I am not a pet to be kept in a cage, Marco," Chiara said on the 4th evening, standing by the glass window, looking out at the city lights. She wore a deep emerald gown that accentuated her full hips and the soft swell of her breasts. Marco sat on a low leather sofa, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He unbuttoned his collar, revealing the dark ink of syndicate tattoos creeping up his neck. "You are not a pet, mia cara," he replied, his voice a dark, velvet purr. "You are a queen. And out there are men who want to tear you apart." Gavin Marsh survived the fall from my father's estate. He knows you are the one who ruined his coup. Chiara turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "And keeping me locked up here is your idea of protection? Or is it just another way to control everything around you?" She expected him to explode. Marco was a man who commanded absolute obedience. A single word of defiance usually earned a man a bullet to the kneecap. Instead, a dark, hungry smile spread across his handsome face. He set his glass down and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He towered over her, the scent of bergamot, smoke, and pure male dominance washing over her. He reached out, his calloused thumb tracing the soft curve of her jawline, moving down to rest over the erratic pulse at her throat. I control my empire, because I must, Kiara, he whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed her ear. But you, I keep you here because the thought of another man looking at you, touching you, knowing the brilliant mind hidden behind those beautiful soft curves, it drives me to the edge of madness. Kiara's breath caught. She had braced herself for cruelty, for indifference. She had not braced herself for this intense, consuming worship. He didn't just want her body. He revered it. He saw the strength in her that the rest of the world ignored. But the fragile bubble of their dark romance was about to burst. Down in the gritty docklands of the South Side, Gavin Marsh was nursing his wounds and his bruised ego. The failed assassination of Vincenzo Gallo had cost him his standing in the Irish syndicate. He was a dead man walking, with the entire Gallo cartel hunting him. But Gavin was a rat backed into a corner, and that made him incredibly dangerous. He sat in a dimly lit warehouse, surrounded by a handful of loyal mercenaries. On the table between them lay a stolen blueprint of the Gallo Tower. "Marco thinks he's untouchable up there," Gavin sneered, tracing a finger over the ventilation shafts and the private elevator routes. But every fortress has a weak point. Gavin looked at a surveillance photograph taken outside the Gallo estate just days prior. It showed Marco carrying Kiara into his armored SUV. Gavin remembered the Maid, the fat, clumsy girl who had shattered his plans. But seeing Marco's defensive posture, the way the ruthless boss shielded her body with his own, Gavin smiled a terrible, jagged smile. "She isn't just a maid anymore," Gavin muttered, tapping the photo. "She is his heart. We don't need to kill Marco Gallo to destroy him. We just need to take what belongs to him." Back in the penthouse, oblivious to the storm gathering below, Kiara found herself drawn deeper into Marco's world. Late at night, unable to sleep, she wandered into his private home office. The room was a mess of encrypted laptops, offshore bank statements, and shipping manifests. Kiara walked over to the main desk. She had always possessed an eidetic memory for numbers, a skill she used to survive the grueling math of poverty. She looked at a ledger left open on the desk. She noticed discrepancies immediately. Phantom shipments, money being bled out of the Gallo accounts through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Marco walked into the office, his presence filling the room instantly. He was shirtless, his heavily scarred torso a roadmap of violence. When he saw her looking at the ledger, his jaw clenched. "You shouldn't be looking at that," he warned, his tone suddenly cold, the Mafia boss returning to the surface. "Someone is stealing from you, Marco," she said, her voice steady, refusing to back down from his intimidating stare. "These shipments, they are routed through the East Coast, but the tax stamps are forged. It's an inside job." Marco froze. He walked slowly to the desk, looking down at the numbers she was pointing to. He had top-tier forensic accountants who had missed this, yet this woman, a former maid, had spotted it in minutes. He looked up at her, the protective obsession in his eyes shifting into something deeper. "Absolute awe." "Kiara," he murmured, stepping closer, trapping her against the edge of the mahogany desk. "Who exactly are you?" "I am a survivor, Marco," she whispered. "Just like you." He crashed his lips onto hers. It was a kiss of fear and violence, possessing and demanding. Chiara met his passion with equal force, her hands tangling in his dark hair, dragging him closer. She felt the cold steel of the gun tucked into the waistband of his sweatpants, pressing against her stomach, a harsh reminder of the dangerous world she had just fully surrendered to. Suddenly, the penthouse plunged into absolute darkness. The power grid had been severed. An alarm began to blare, a harsh, mechanical shrieking that echoed off the glass walls. Marco broke the kiss immediately, his romantic obsession instantly replaced by the lethal instincts of an apex predator. He drew his weapon, shoving Chiara behind his broad back. "Get into the panic room," he ordered, his voice like cracking ice. "Now!" Before Chiara could move, the sound of an explosion rocked the building, blowing the heavy steel doors of the penthouse off their hinges. Gavin Marsh had arrived, and he had brought hell with him. Smoke grenades hissed, filling the sprawling living room of the Gallo Tower penthouse with a dense, acrid cloud. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline was obscured by chaos as heavily armed mercenaries poured through the blown-out entrance. Laser sights cut through the darkness like predatory red eyes, searching for targets. Marco Gallo moved with the lethal, fluid grace of an apex predator. He shoved Chiara Ferraro behind the heavy marble island in the kitchen, his massive frame shielding her soft, trembling body from the hail of bullets shredding the custom cabinetry above them. "Stay low, Chiara," Marco commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that cut through the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. "Do not move until I tell you." Chiara pressed her back against the cold marble, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clamped her hands over her ears, but she refused to squeeze her eyes shut. She had spent her entire life making herself small, hiding her plus-sized figure in baggy clothes, lowering her eyes to avoid the cruelty of the world. But as she watched Marco rack the slide of his weapon, his muscles corded with tension, she realized she could no longer be a passive observer in her own life. Marco was fighting a small army to protect her, and she would not let him die because she was too paralyzed by fear to act. Marco leaned around the edge of the island, firing 3 controlled, precise shots. 3 heavy thuds echoed over the noise as mercenaries dropped to the floor, lifeless. But there were too many of them. Gavin Marsh had brought a death squad, and they were advancing steadily, pinning Marco down with suppressive fire. "Gallo!" Gavin's voice echoed through the ruined penthouse, dripping with sadistic glee. "You cannot hold out forever. Give me the girl, and I will make your death quick. Keep her, and I will make you watch as my men take their time with her." A primal, terrifying snarl ripped from Marco's throat. He dropped an empty magazine, slapped a fresh one into his handgun, and fired blindly to keep the advancing men at bay. He looked down at Chiara, his dark eyes blazing with an obsession so deep it bordered on madness. "I will burn this city to ash before they lay a single finger on you," he whispered, blood trickling from a shallow graze on his cheek. Chiara's mind, a razor-sharp trap that had just decoded million-dollar financial discrepancies minutes prior, began to race. She visualized the blueprints she had seen in Marco's office. She remembered the layout of the penthouse, the ventilation shafts, the private elevator routes, and most importantly, the environmental controls. "The smart home system," she muttered, looking around frantically. "What?" Marco asked, ducking as another volley of bullets shattered the remaining glass in the kitchen. "Marco, the environmental control panel is on the wall behind you," Chiara said, her voice remarkably steady. "The server room we were just in. It runs on a localized halon gas fire suppression system. If I can access the master panel, I can override the safety protocols and trigger the halon gas in the main living area. It will suffocate the oxygen." Marco stared at her, awe briefly piercing through his lethal concentration. "Halon gas will suffocate us too, Mia cara. Not if we make it to the panic room in the master bedroom," Chiara replied, her dark eyes locking onto his. "We have 30 seconds before the system purges the air. Can you cover me?" Marco did not hesitate. He did not question her intellect or her bravery. He simply nodded, a dangerous, proud smirk touching his lips. "On my mark." Marco stood up fully, exposing himself to the incoming fire, and unleashed a relentless barrage of bullets toward the hallway, drawing every ounce of the mercenaries' attention. "Go!" Marco roared. Chiara moved. She did not possess the lithe, athletic frame of an action hero, but her lush body was fueled by pure adrenaline and an unbreakable will to survive. She lunged across the open space, sliding heavily on the debris-covered floor until she reached the sleek glass panel on the wall. Her fingers flew across the touchscreen, her eidetic memory, recalling the administrative bypass codes she had passively noticed on Marco's desk earlier that week. "Warning," a synthetic female voice announced over the alarms. "Fire suppression system activated. Evacuate immediately." White, heavy gas began pouring from the ceiling vents, instantly dropping the temperature in the room and rapidly consuming the oxygen. The mercenaries began to cough wildly, their tactical formations dissolving into blind panic as they choked on the thick, suffocating air. Chiara felt Marco's heavy, blood-stained hand grip her arm. He pulled her flush against his side, practically carrying her as they sprinted through the blinding white fog toward the master bedroom. Chiara's lungs burned, the lack of oxygen making her vision swim. But Marco's relentless grip kept her anchored to reality. They burst into the bedroom, Marco slamming his hand against a hidden biometric scanner behind a painting. A heavy steel door slid open, revealing the fortified panic room. He shoved Chiara inside just as a dark, hulking figure lunged from the shadows of the bedroom. It was Gavin. He had bypassed the living room entirely, sneaking through the guest quarters to cut them off. Gavin tackled Marco to the floor, driving a serrated hunting knife toward Marco's chest. Marco caught Gavin's wrist, the two men grappling in a brutal, silent struggle of raw, violent strength. Marco was stronger, but he was exhausted and bleeding, and Gavin had the advantage of surprise. Slowly, the tip of the knife began to inch closer to Marco's throat. Chiara stood in the doorway of the panic room. The protocol was to hit the seal button and lock herself safely inside. That is what a maid would do. That is what a frightened civilian would do. But Chiara Ferraro was done hiding. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a heavy, solid brass lamp resting on the bedside table. She did not hesitate. Chiara grabbed the lamp, gripping it with both hands, and brought it down with every ounce of her strength onto the back of Gavin Marsh's skull. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Gavin went entirely limp, collapsing heavily onto the floor. Marco lay there for a second, his chest heaving as he stared up at the woman standing over him. She was breathing heavily, her gorgeous emerald dress torn, her dark hair wild, holding a bloody brass lamp like a scepter. Marco slowly pushed Gavin's unconscious body off him and stood up. He did not check his wounds. He did not secure the perimeter. He walked directly to Chiara, took the lamp from her trembling hands, and dropped it to the floor. He cupped her face in his large, rough hands, smearing his blood against her soft cheeks. He crashed his mouth down on hers, kissing her with a ferocious, desperate hunger. It was a claiming, a vow, an absolute surrender to the woman who had just saved his life for the second time. "You are a goddess," Marco breathed against her lips, his thumbs tracing the full, soft curve of her lower lip. "My beautiful, brilliant goddess." The aftermath of the siege was a bloody, quiet affair. The remaining Irish mercenaries had suffocated in the living room, their bodies dragged out through the freight elevators by Marco's cleanup crew before the morning sun even rose over Lake Michigan. Gavin Marsh, severely concussed but alive, was bound to a steel chair in the soundproof basement of the Gallo Tower, awaiting a fate far worse than a quick bullet. But the violence of the night was only half the battle. There was still the matter of the ledger, the phantom shipments, and the traitor within the Gallo syndicate. 24 hours later, the private boardroom of the Gallo enterprise was filled with the highest-ranking capos of the Chicago underworld. These were hard, vicious men who had spent their lives dealing in extortion, racketeering, and murder. They sat around a massive mahogany table, murmuring in low, tense voices, waiting for their dawn. The heavy oak doors opened, and absolute silence fell over the room. Marco Gallo walked in. He wore a sharp, charcoal grey suit, concealing the bandages wrapping his torso. But the men in the room were not looking at Marco. They were staring at the woman, walking confidently by his side. Chiara wore a tailored dark crimson power suit that hugged her generous curves perfectly, her thick dark hair styled sleekly over her shoulders. She held a thick leather folder in her hands. The men exchanged confused, disrespectful glances. To them, she was a nobody, a plus-sized maid who had somehow wormed her way into the Don's bed. Arthur Rossi, a silver-haired underboss who had served under Marco's father for 30 years, slammed his hand on the table. "Marco, what is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded, his face flushing with anger. "We are here to discuss syndicate business. You bring a servant into a closed council. This is a blatant disrespect to our traditions." Marco did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply looked at Arthur with a gaze so incredibly devoid of humanity that the older man swallowed hard and sat back down. Marco pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table. But he did not sit. He gestured for Chiara to take the seat. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The seat at the head of the table belonged solely to the Don. To offer it to a woman, let alone a former maid, was unprecedented. Chiara felt the crushing weight of their stares, the silent judgment of her body and her background. But she remembered Marco's words in the panic room. She remembered the fire in his eyes. She sat down, her posture perfect, projecting a cold, unwavering authority. Marco stood behind her, resting his hands firmly on her shoulders, a silent threat to any man who dared to challenge her. "Chiara is not a servant," Marco addressed the room, his voice a lethal purr. "She is the woman who saved my father's life. She is the woman who saved my life. And as of tonight, she is my equal in this syndicate." More murmurs erupted, but Marco silenced them with a single, sharp look. "We have a rat," Marco continued, pacing slowly behind Chiara. "Someone has been bleeding our accounts dry, funneling money through the Cayman Islands to fund Gavin Marsh's coup. Someone sitting at this very table." The capos began to shout, accusing one another, defending their honor. Arthur Rossi stood up again, pointing a finger at a younger capo across the table. "It has to be Dante," Arthur yelled. "He controls the East Coast shipping routes. The phantom shipments would pass right under his nose." Chiara opened the leather folder. She did not look at the papers. She did not need to. The numbers were seared into her flawless memory. "It isn't Dante," Chiara said. Her voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable weight that commanded the room's attention. Arthur sneered at her. And how would a maid know anything about international shipping logistics? Kiara looked directly at Arthur, her dark eyes cold and unyielding. Because the discrepancies are hidden in the tax stamps, Arthur. The shipments were routed through the East Coast, yes, but the offshore shell companies receiving the funds were registered under a dummy corporation named Palermo Holdings. She flipped a single piece of paper across the polished table. It slid to a halt directly in front of Arthur. Palermo Holdings was incorporated in 1998, Kiara continued, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. The exact year your daughter moved to Sicily. Furthermore, the encryption key used to bypass the syndicate's internal auditors matches the serial number of the rare Patek Philippe, watch you are currently wearing on your left wrist. The color drained entirely from Arthur Rossi's face. He looked down at his watch, then up at Marco, sheer terror radiating from his eyes. "Marco," Arthur stammered, sweating profusely. "This is a setup. The girl is lying. She is a witch, a manipulator." Marco moved faster than a striking viper. He drew his weapon and fired a single round. The bullet tore through Arthur's knee, shattering the bone. Arthur collapsed to the floor, screaming in agony, clutching his ruined leg as blood pooled on the expensive carpet. The other capos jumped, but none reached for their weapons. They understood the hierarchy. They understood the consequence of treason. "Take him to the basement," Marco ordered his enforcers, not even looking at the bleeding man on the floor. "Put him in the room next to Gavin Marsh. Let them discuss their failed coup together." As Arthur was dragged screaming from the boardroom, Marco looked at the remaining capos. They were pale, trembling, looking at Kiara not with disdain, but with absolute, terrified respect. She had dismantled a 30-year veteran of the Mafia with nothing but her mind and a stack of papers. "Are there any other objections to my queen's presence?" Marco asked softly. The room remained dead silent. Every man slowly shook his head. "Get out!" Marco commanded. Within seconds, the boardroom was empty, leaving only Marco and Kiara. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Kiara let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. She leaned back in the heavy leather chair, her hands trembling slightly. Marco holstered his weapon and walked around the table. He knelt beside her chair, a man who bowed to absolutely no one, placing himself at her feet. He took her trembling hands in his, pressing his lips to her soft knuckles. "You were magnificent," he murmured, looking up at her with that same dark, consuming reverence. "You tore him apart." "I was terrified," Kiara admitted softly, looking down at his handsome, scarred face. "I am not a killer, Marco. I am not a gangster." "You are whatever you choose to be, Kiara," he replied fiercely. "For your entire life, the world told you that you were not enough, that you were too soft, too big, too invisible. But they were blind. I see you. I see the brilliant, dangerous, gorgeous woman that you are." He stood up, pulling her out of the chair and flush against his hard chest. His hands roamed over her generous curves, worshipping every inch of her body, completely obsessed with her softness and her strength. "You belong to me," Marco whispered, his lips brushing against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. "And I belong to you. We rule this city together." Kiara wrapped her arms around his neck, finally accepting the dark, beautiful reality of her new life. She had entered this world as an invisible maid, whispering a single word to an old man to save his life. Now she was the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld, held tightly in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city. and as she kissed him back, tasting the blood and the bourbon on his lips, Chiara Ferraro knew she would never be invisible again. Did Chiara's journey from an invisible maid to the brilliant, ruthless queen of the Chicago Syndicate leave you breathless? Her hidden genius and Marco's deadly, unwavering devotion prove that true power lies beneath the surface. If you loved this dark, high-stakes Mafia romance and want more gritty underworld tales, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends. Leave a comment below with your favorite intense moment. And make sure to subscribe